continuing and concluding Chapter 4 of The American Home Front, 1941 to 1942 by Alistair Cooke. South again! To Atlanta, you follow Sherman's predatory route, through a fine valley with the mountains on your left, and soon the highway cuts clean between rolling red clay hills. It is at about this time that it becomes hard to recall the picture of the northern landscape. All around you are the trees of the deep South, hickory, shortleaf pine, gum, and spacious oaks. And crowning them, as a reminder that Florida is ahead, are bulging piles of cumulus clouds. The air is moist and warm. You go through fields of cotton and corn, and much spare land is being turned over to the growing of peanuts. In the Georgia back country, many a county agent is going out to sell a poor farmer on the new idea that growing peanuts is a privilege and a service to one's country. "These few acres of yours are going to be mighty useful to the government," says an agent to the poor Negro. "Mr. McDowell," the Negro replies, his thumbs locked in his suspenders, "the government can have 'em. This ain't nothing but bad old cotton land." He is informed that the government will give him a loan if he'll put his land into peanuts. "Peanuts!" he howls. "The government must sure be enough in terrible shape." "Yes, we want peanuts for the fats and oils, and we need eggs, millions of 'em, to dry for the army, and to send overseas. Can you raise some hens here, you think?" The Negro looks aghast. "Mr. McDowell, if the government wants to pay me for raising elephants, I'll sure make a powerful try." A single incident like this illustrates a native modesty or indifference in the Southern farmer that will deprive him in the record of much of his due credit in the war program. The poorer ones, especially, have accepted a dependence on the Department of Agriculture, and a rather bewildered trust in its recommendations, which would undoubtedly strike our Louisville doctor as a sign of the decay of American individualism. But the Farm Security Administration has kept alive, at the smallest reckoning, a tenth of the nation's poorest farmers, and it would be fastidious to ask where they are to be found. They are mostly in the South. As the large combines rushed for the available steel equipment after Pearl Harbor, the poor farmer waited for a loan and was helped to buy feed and fertilizer, which are his only capital. In Virginia, West Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Kentucky, over 50,000 farm families accepted food production loans for cows, sows, and hens. They managed, in their undemonstrative way, to market 2 million cockerels. All through the Deep South, they are being offered loans to grow peanuts and soybeans, in a region whose small farmers still cling with pathetic stubbornness to the unchanging single crop, cotton. Among the qualities that the South shares with Britain, one of them is undoubtedly the total inability or indifference to advertise its skills. You could drive 1,000 miles through the South today and not hear much about the vast and subtle changes that are transforming its landscape. To a Northerner or a Westerner, it is a monotonous landscape, growing cotton and corn all the way to a horizon fringed with inevitable pine. But it is deeply known to its own people, and I do not think it an accident that the most indigenous descriptions of American life and food and growing things are written not by the more flamboyant Midwestern and Western talents, strenuously aware of their unique American context, but by Southerners who take for granted the land that reared them. William March is a brilliant example of a writer who hardly seems to be aware of himself as an intensely American writer. His novels and stories happen to be set against the background he knows, and the dialect is merely what he best recalls. But seen from the outside, the background is the infinitely known landscape of the Deep South, and the language, in all its delicacy and rightness, could be heard nowhere else. Similarly, The poor Negro stumbling off to grow peanuts because the government man says to plant peanuts cannot think of his work as a vital contribution to the war effort. He does not read as much advertising copy as other Americans, and Southern newspapers are composed in a more sober idiom than the Bridgeport Herald or the Los Angeles Examiner. So, clear down to the Gulf, thousands of Southern farmers are growing peanuts and soybean, and they may tell you in a shambling, uncertain way that they understand the government needs them. They do not know or seem to care much that they will be planting most of the nation's million extra acres of peanuts and 3 million extra acres of soybeans. Very few of them, I suspect, could tell you that their humble peanuts will make up for the loss of coconut oil that we imported from the captured Philippines and the Netherlands East Indies, and their soybean for the palm oils that, when labor and transport were cheap, we took easily from Latin America. Down through this pleasant country you pass little cabins with pelts strung under the porch and a sign out, "Handmade Furs." Running alongside cabins that stand on grassless soil are rows of beautiful jonquils. You pause by a field, an automobile junk heap, and notice the grim indication of a war in which the United States was cut off at the start from its main source of rubber. There are hundreds of rusty and decrepit automobiles, looking as usual like an anthology of old accidents, like a rusty memorial to the hip flask era of American culture. But you notice that not one of them has an inch of rubber. Every other part of a car is frozen in its rotting state, but every single car is naked of its tires. At a gas station, you ask the attendant casually for a road map of Georgia. He goes inside his office, is gone a long time, and comes out wearing a smiling frown. He blows the dust off and hands it over. He says, "They're hard to get a hold to. Can't hardly get." This detail registers as alarmingly as the shortage of Coca-Cola in Huntington, West Virginia. From Dalton to Marietta is the chenille counterpane belt. All the way along the highway you see bath mats and bright rugs and bedspreads hung on clotheslines. Some of the farmers who help their wives with the tufting of the bedspreads hope in a nervous way that the army will like their designs and place an enormous order. I hope that, when you consider the riotous designs the Georgia wives like to indulge in, seems doomed to defeat. You pass on to a fine divided highway, and in the sunless haze ahead of you is the town of Scarlett O'Hara, the town of rearing smokestacks, clanging railroad shops, hustling fruit markets, of textiles, Coca-Cola, and sidewalk rabbis, of factories going up and going down, of clattering streetcars, paper mills, refrigerator plants, the home of bakers, painters, soft drink executives, railroad men, and garment workers, the brash, noisy, smoky city that stands as a healthy enigma to any visiting debutante from the north come to look for Peachtree Street and Clark Gable. Atlanta. Atlanta always looks as if it's being made over, but now there is more riveting than ever, more construction, more wrecking, more seeming haste and preparations for booming business, and air raids, and for a war to be lived in the ways that the teeming cities of the eastern seaboard know. If it is true, as a fair-minded Southerner has said, that Sherman's occupation hurt the South less than the tariff, and that the economic occupation hurt the South less than the tariff, and that the economic occupation of the South by the North had hardly ended in 1938, Atlanta is surely the town to prove it. A Southerner may call it a symbol of the New South, and keep his head up when he says it before strangers. But I doubt it is the kind of symbol he would have chosen. The investing capital comes from the East. It is Chicago grafted on to Charleston or Savannah. What is most Southern about it is the guaranteed presence of an inexhaustible source of cheap labor. But you do not look here for wartime changes in Southern folkways. All the signs are the signs of a metropolis at war. The bookshops have stacked piles of first aid books. A bestseller, widely advertised, is a book called How Your Business Can Win the War. The hardware stores are advertising luminous paint for civilian blackouts, and the hotel requests that you never leave a room with its lights on. The saving of electric current is necessary for the production of aluminum for fighter planes. There seems everywhere a more nervous alertness to the prospect of air raids than in any town you've seen, and it seems strange that a visiting English lecturer, they are still around, should choose to tell the people of this awakened industrial city that war may have to be burned into the minds of American women before they'll know it's a life and death affair. You go back to your hotel room, and on the door is a prominent notice saying, "Before a blackout, all lights in this hotel will blink 3 times at intervals of 5 seconds, then again after 5 minutes. Draw shades, lock the door, stay away from the window. There will be no transportation during actual raids." You ask who make up this alert crew of civilian defenders, and your answer lowers his head, smiles with his eyes, and asks a strange riddle. If you live in Atlanta, what's the first thing you ask of anybody? I ask to be told. He says quietly, "Are you an air raid warden or a Gentile?" It tells you more about an attitude to bombing than all the first aid books, hotel notices, and public handbills. It tells you also that Atlanta must either be like New York or Kansas City. It must have a lot of Jews, or almost none, for these seem to be the first conditions of anti-Semitism. The answer is that Atlanta is, in this respect, more like New York. You notice in the newspapers and in general conversation a kind of easygoing acquiescence to the British view of the war. This is not to say that the Deep South is particularly pro-British or anti-British. It merely does not seem to react, as some parts of the country traditionally do, against the war interpretations that come from London. But Georgia has problems of its own that are debated more urgently than the war. And the sorest of these is the cracker regime of Governor Eugene Talmadge. Like most southern cities, Atlanta has better than its share of determined liberals, in a region where being a liberal is as hard on an individual endurance as being a conscientious objector in a city at war. The ambition of these people in Georgia had been to have the state constitution revised. No revolutionary itch in this. A revision every 10 years is promised in the Constitution itself. But as the years go by, it gets harder and harder to loosen a vested interest away from its foundations, if only to give it more breathing space elsewhere. In Atlanta, the cry is for redistricting and sweet release from the county unit system, whereby the electoral system is figured on antique population figures, which consequently allow 2 representatives in the state legislature to the smallest county, with a population of a few hundred, and only 6 representatives to Atlanta, which has a population of nearly 500,000. Northerners politely but condescendingly bemoan the superstitious ignorance of Georgia in allowing a man like Talmadge to have and hold such high elective office. But there are Democrats in Atlanta as enlightened and courageous as any in New York or Cleveland. They happen to be the angry victims of a system that is a total failure as an index of the effective intelligence of its citizens. Thousands of liberals in Atlanta can meet and parade and spout floods of good passion against the dominance of Talmadge, but all he needs to do if he feels his throne wobbling is to climb in an old roadster, drive out to 2 or 3 surrounding counties, say "hiya" to a friendly farmer or 2, and ride back to Atlanta secure in the knowledge that he has assured himself of 6 supporting votes, which is as much as Atlanta can muster if every man, woman, and child there turns against him. You drive out of Atlanta on the road to Mason, and pass through some of these rolling counties of the Piedmont that swear allegiance to old Gene. The barns are unpainted but well stored. There are plenty of vegetables. These farmers are not prosperous, but neither are they poor enough to be leery of folksy promises. To have the land support them in this malleable state has been the lucky experience of Jean Talmage. The slopes of the hills swim up and away from you, and careful contour plowing curves over the hills like waves of surf. Every other roadside sign is an advertisement for pecans. This little drive to Mason superficially reflects the war less than any landscape you have seen. If you go into the Georgia Experimental Station just before Griffin, you will learn that they are doing laboratory experiments on pecan parasites, planning to teach the surrounding farmers simple ways of putting their fruits and vegetables into cold storage. You learn there is intense excitement, in a laboratory kind of way, over the wartime possibilities of Georgia's muscadine grape. Perhaps a variety can be found that the Army will want to use. According to the scientists, the Army is looking for a favorite fruit with a high vitamin content that can be packed into the mysterious and precious K ration. But aside from these minor excitements, there is nothing in the emerging spring around you to tell of war. The drive into Mason and all the natural symbols are of an easy, spacious town of the Deep South. The even spacing of palmettos along broad streets, the crepe myrtles, boxwood hedges, and in the air the smell of warm blossom. Strolling in a speculative sort of way down the main street is a boy in the gray-blue uniform of a Royal Air Force cadet. He is less shy to approach than most young Englishmen, which is understandable enough since he turns out to be a Scot, and weighs everything he says with a kind of judicial gravity. Now, does he like the country? He likes the country, and the people have been more than friendly. But he speaks for more of the cadets than himself when he says that he doesn't like the training. It seems, at least in this stage of the transatlantic training of the RAF boys, that they haven't managed to work out a form of discipline that is acceptable to training Britons, and yet would not suggest to nearby American soldiers the personal advantages of anarchy. The Scot thinks that Americans have not heard how different and new to British military traditions is the Royal Air Force, and how much further away than a quarter century are its customs from those of the Royal Flying Corps of the last war. His observations are pointed sharply by the sudden appearance of half a dozen other British trainees. They join in the conversation shyly but easily, and in a moment you recognize the accents of the ordinary people of London, Lancashire, the Midlands, and Scotland. These boys, whether they know it or not, are the first rough hue of a new generation of English democrats. However aware of social and class differences, they don't show the old characteristic servility of an enlisted man before an officer who sprang from a family life, an education, and a code of manners as foreign to the working-class habits of England as the blubber-feeding ceremonies of an Eskimo wife and her mate. These boys were not recruited out of a theory of social democracy. They were Britons, 17 years of age, who were available, deceptively apt, and in a galumphing way responsible and personally courageous. They all agreed that the training here, demanding 210 flying hours for their wings instead of 150 at home, was a great advantage, and they were grateful for the daily practice on the ground inside link trainers, in which they can be fed any kind of atmosphere or navigational hazard that they will know on top of the clouds. But they came back all the time to solemn head-shaking over petty punishments that, in the hard-working, unsentimental grind of the RAF, they had never known at home. They were aghast at the sight of American soldiers doing penance for some casual crime or impudence by walking up and down a yard in full kit in steaming heat. They were also bewildered by being required to salute officers of a land army. They all felt that this obligation to respect an alien and to them old-fashioned military etiquette was a daily irritation. But when they seemed to be pressing the point, one of them would mention the people and what they had learned from the South. With great seriousness, the Scot said, "I have 2 or 3 homes here, and it's the same, I think, with all of us." They each tried out on the others their own highly unconvincing performance of Southern idiom. They had evidently dredged up from the sea of strange language all about them several pearls they meant to hold on to. A small boy from a London suburb threw his head back like a man about to imitate a coyote and said, "I betcha!" with a rare expression of pride. As we drove away from Mason, the RAF boys waved to us. The bony Scot flashed his even teeth. "Bye, y'all," he moaned. Down through Mason and Cochrane we drive through prosperous, rolling farmland, and the road shoots through fine forests of longleaf pine. Near Cochrane the red earth turns sandy, and you know that you have pulled out of the Piedmont and will soon be heading across the coastal plain. There are cheerful roadside invitations to "come and see us," and soon it's made clear that these refer to a free zoo ahead, performing coon, rattles, snake. The war does not seem to have affected snake life so far, but raccoons have other uses than performing for southern tourists, and are hard to come by. We're now heading due southeast on US 341, and on both sides of the road is cottonland. Near Helena, the pink blossoms of peach orchards pepper the countryside, and a cryptic advertisement appears for bees and queens, Italians and Caucasians. Tall pines flash by, and more of them show the sharp white gash that tells of nearby turpentine stills. This is a flat, sandy country, and you might think that all the prosperous farmers were behind you in the Piedmont. But this flat section of central Georgia has the perfect cotton climate, and even if there were no fresh fields to clear, there is enough fertilizer to go on sucking cotton from soil that long ago produced its best. Today the county agents have better arguments than usual to urge a wider diversity of crops, and with the export cotton market practically frozen, farmers who had made it a principle never to grow anything but cotton are turning to dairying, peaches, and poultry raising. Outside Waycross you see an elaborate layout of motor courts, but not a tourist or automobile in sight. After Waycross, the highway bridges the first small stagnant swamps, and where there are oaks, tufts of moss are hanging from them. You are now on the edge of the great Okefenokee Swamp, and you wonder if the war can have any interest in conquering the wilderness of 600 square miles of scummy water and ghostly timber. We drive up a dirt road to Camp Cornelia, and in the brooding heat of the afternoon, two big black buzzards flap away from a mess of unrecognizable carrion in the middle of the road. A turtle ambles out of a swamp shadow, and as you hear only the very distant cawing of an owl and the curious low throb of the swamp's wildlife, you seem to be geological ages away from any war or civilized peace. But the sharp reminder comes again when you try to get a boat and a guide through the swamp. There are no guides, and the man who employed them has gone off to Jacksonville to get a defense job. You think of bargaining with his wife for a while, but there's no hope for it. The great Okefenokee is something you will have to forego until Mr. Harold Ickes and the Interior Department can get the guides and rangers back again and restore the national parks and monuments to the old, easy accessibility of the 1930s. We cross the St. Mary's River and the Florida line shortly after Folkestone, and see pink dogwood out and peach trees in blossom. There is no doubt about the principal crop ahead, for all that highway signs start appealing to it, the northern tourist. A broken airplane is merely a restaurant and an invitation to dinner. Every shape and size of trick advertising is planted by the highway and forms almost a separate species of Florida scrub pine. A few of the signs are simple advertisements for hotels, motels, tourist courts. Most of them magnanimously share a confidence with the southbound tourist, warning him against those who may be more indifferent to his welfare. Don't be misled by cut-rate hotel folders. The slash pines flick by like roadside markers, and soon the tourist camps form a wide fringe of petticoats all the way into Jacksonville. As you drive into Jacksonville, you will notice that its proudest beacon has been blacked out, the high electric sign over the municipally owned light plant that preached the slogan, "Do it electrically." The retail stores are doing a roaring business, and though the women's dresses in the store windows are as carefree as ever, there are more uniforms behind glass than you have seen before. Some of the 100-passenger trains, which Jacksonville boasted was the regular daily flow during the winter tourist season, are being unceremoniously sidetracked for troop trains rolling in and out. There are barricades of freshly cut timber piled up in the warehouses and along the wharfs down by the river. But to Jacksonville, the war has made most demands on two of its most ancient industries, turpentine and prostitution. Jacksonville is the Atlantic capital of the naval stores industry. The name needs printing in quotes because ever since the New World shipped its first load of turpentine and rosin to England in 1608, naval stores has meant the turpentine industry. The mainstay of the industry is a tribe that is cute to the literary tourist, contemptible to the resident white, and essential to the Navy. They are the turpentine niggers who have been as typical inhabitants of the Florida peninsula for the past 40 years as an oleander or a Seminole. The chipping of the pine for its gum, which is then distilled into turpentine and rosin, is a Negro monopoly for the commonest and most wearisome reason. It is work thought unfit for whites. If the weather stays fine, a Negro worker in a turpentine camp may expect to make $1, even as much as $1.50 a day. He lives in a pine camp with his spouse, and together they produce offspring who would need little schooling, even if they could get it, before they learn to toddle off and tap the pines. You do not see these miserable families in Jacksonville or anywhere in towns, and nobody misses them much. They are, however, one of those subterranean populations of essential American workers who bear the same relation to what we call our American society, as H.G. Wells's brutish slaves, who supplied the intelligent people above ground with most of their essential needs. In 1942, they will produce half as much turpentine again as Florida normally supplies, because Washington has insisted that a 50% increase in naval stores is essential for the successful promotion of the war. It is only fair to say that the Negroes have been helped in this lucky patriotic assignment by the discovery of the Russians that if you splay a sulfuric acid solution on a slash pine, it will yield exactly the increase of gum that Washington is after. The other troublesome trade is one that no reasonably adult citizen of Jacksonville will try to belittle. It is what our solemn forefathers called the traffic in human souls. The soldiers who invade the town at weekends have a more relaxed and perhaps grimmer name for it. They call it recreation. By the spring of 1942, there were 130,000 soldiers to whom Jacksonville was home, playground, and metropolis. With 2 swelling camps nearby, there will be many more of them, and Jacksonville and the Surgeon General have good cause to worry. In the First World War, Florida could boast a higher percentage of draftees with venereal disease than any state in the Union. From the figures of the Surgeon General's office, the record has been maintained at this time. The red light district has been closed to servicemen, and it is patrolled by the military and shore police. This, you hear, satisfied the Jacksonville natives for a time, but a U.S. public health officer concludes that the main difference the military patrol has made was that now they draw the shades. Whether or not the residents knew this, they started to make complaints as hordes of the ousted ladies moved into apartment houses, hotels, and bungalows whose morals had never been formerly called into question. We start out of Jacksonville and begin the long drive south, down into the never-never land of the Florida peninsula. You drive through the cut-over pine land, past rambling ditches thick with fern, the road fringed with dusty cabbage palms. A wooden post shows a hand pointing to heaven and bears the threat, "Prepare to meet thy God." This is no subtlety of advertising, just a reminder that grim and godly men have come through here and stuck up their signs along a highway of winter tourists. We see blue iris shining out of cypress swamps, through St. Augustine and south across salt marshes, down through small turpentine towns, through Corona, a potato town populated, needless to say, by Poles. Past Daytona, orange groves appear fenced with pine windbreaks. This is the beginning of the winter resort belt. Fronting on the highway is a trailer camp. In front of a newly painted trailer, 3 men in late middle age, wearing seersucker pants and polo shirts of blue and green, are merrily pitching horseshoes. They are, by their accent, farm people from the Corn Belt, and their wives sit contentedly on the trailer steps knitting and making cracks about the comparative senility of their mates. Just along the road is a fruit stand boasting, "Orange juice 10 cents all you can drink." One of the horseshoe pitchers, a rattled old man with silver hair and an enormous grin, calls out, "And they mean it, too." The wives go back to watching the game. You think, perhaps impertinently, of the wasting children of Europe. It seems the wrong time and place to ask about the war. In the evening, you sit around outside a beach hotel and listen to the talk of a baseball team owned by a soft drink firm. Many of them are young and husky enough to begin worrying about the draft, but aside from these personal fears, which they pretend to kid into thin air, the only war talk is the sort you will hear along all the beaches from here to Miami. There is lurid speculation and dramatic rumor about the chances of Jacksonville being shelled. You hear the story many times, with many attractive variations, about a pocket submarine being washed up somewhere off the coast, well stocked with loaves of bread bearing the unnecessary label, "Baked in Miami." The bartender recalls that, in the last war, the Germans sank oil tankers at precise locations in the Atlantic from which submarines could refuel, and there is much cynical agreement that the Nazis hold the whip hand in the Battle of the Atlantic. Since the submarine's first appearance off the Atlantic coast in the middle of January, 72 American ships have gone down, 72 merchantmen. And everybody is mad, but the only retaliation reported came from a crew of a freighter. Somebody has an editorial from a Tampa newspaper that chalks up the score for the Nazis at 72-0, and indignantly asks the Secretary of the Navy to search for the operating base for these submarines and do something about it, and now. After the swift twilight falls, you stroll barefoot along the warm sands and watch steel-black clouds loom over the horizon. A palm tree rustles uneasily, and far off to the south the sky winks with sheet lightning. Then suddenly out of nowhere comes an electric storm that leaves you standing on the terrace blinded by the stutter of blue lightning. Just as you're saying a little private prayer for those in peril on the sea, the bartender, who was on a merchantman in the last war, reckons the men on the tankers will be grateful for a little rest. It seems impossible that anybody out there could stay afloat in the plunging foam. But the bartender is a Florida native. That is to say, he's a man from Chicago who's been here 20 years. And we soon take the breathless spectacle for granted and fall into a close discussion on the relative hazards of two trades, whether men on tankers or submarines rate the heavier pay. And once again it occurs to you, what had first struck you in the lumber towns of West Virginia, that ordinary people talk very little about the strategy of the war, or indeed about the battles lost and won, but think first and always about the way the war affects their work. The work of Florida is in outline almost brutally simple to describe. It is the sale of its climate. Either directly to a couple of million people it can lure down each winter from the north, or indirectly in cans and boxes in the shape of oranges and grapefruit or citrus juices. Way behind these two products is the frantic cultivation of vegetables to be shipped north before Georgia and the Carolinas can get enough sunlight to grow a sizable competition. The moment you start to go inland from Daytona, the sand ridges turn into luxurious citrus groves, and from DeLand all the way across the peninsula to Tampa, you will see and smell vineyards and truck gardens that make Florida's second crop. But from here, on the coast road, always point to the first crop, over grassy marshlands, sand flats tunneling through little jungles and pine woods, over salt marshes splotched with sunflowers, through small citrus ports whose streets are lined with coconut and date palms. Then after Fort Pierce, the tropical seascape merges into Coney Island, and the roadside signs plead and beg and shriek at you, offering everything from a winter escapist, from trailer camps to patent medicines and guava jelly. After Jupiter, you drive for many miles between rising inland dunes covered with palmettos, and on your left the ocean, a light translucent green, is breaking gently on a sloping yellow beach. This is what Florida means to millions of Americans, and Florida knows it. You pick up a copy of a Miami Beach newspaper, the Miami Beach Daily Tropics, and a banner headline proclaims, "Record snow blankets east." Underneath is a single headline, a third the size, "Japs report capture of Tuango." It is the second headline that makes you look out across the smooth, wide beach and suggests what a good place this would be for the drilling of soldiers. By the time you get to Miami Beach, you learn that the Army has had the same idea. Army procurement officers have been down here and taken options on a half-dozen small hotels. The Army says that they are thinking of Miami Beach as an ideal place to establish the Air Corps Replacement and Training Center and the Air Corps Officer Candidate School. But the big hotel keepers are unalarmed. They feel that, although the Army shows excellent judgment in drafting the climate, they will undoubtedly cooperate with maximum patriotism and arrange to win the war, and yet not intrude on the healthful capers of their million winter visitors. It is a curious fact you have noticed in other places that the last people to believe in the possibility of total war are those whose living is made out of total pleasure. The old order may change, giving place to communes, European federations, a self-governing India, and a liberated China, but as one hotel operator says, "All joking aside, there doesn't really seem to be any urgent reason why Miami Beach shouldn't go on next year and the year after that, as it has done in the past. After all, this place is a sort of sanctuary of American morale." You spend a day and a night looking at what morale can mean to rich widows, spry old executives in white caps and golf shoes, to upper-class families with bouncing children, to tanning debs, to the theater people and unattached playboys and other such, who, from the restless tension of their appearance, would certainly seem to be in need of a winter's course in morale. The visible shell of this community has been twice made over, and in the late 1930s, during the period of Miami's second boom, it became an architect's playground. Some of the big, newer hotels on the beach are working models of most of the resources of modern design, using a beautiful range of cement, glass, steel, light metals, and the widest use of plastics. By contrast, the ritzy spots of the 1920s are very sad and crumbly, being in the main cocky little essays in MGM Rococo, in tiled roofs and pebble facades. There is no denying the melancholy fact that the only clubs that lay any claim to age and exclusiveness, unfortunately, lay claim as well to the architectural styles of the period, namely to various sorts of California bungalows, sometimes dignified with the name of Spanish patio style, combined with vague aspirations toward Morocco. The apotheosis of this contrast between the refined but crummy and the upstart but good design is made vivid by comparing the Ultra Surf Club, so exclusive that the only regular inhabitants are the staff, with a small, cleanly designed nightclub that mimics the friendly craze for Latin America by calling itself El Dumpo, and greets the visitor with the unexclusive sign, "Bums, this is one place where you're welcome." At 11 o'clock in the morning, the streamlined pleasure forts come to life. The bold, the glamorous, the lobster-faced new arrivals line up at the hotel desk and cash checks at a window over which hangs a handsome metal sign with inlaid letters, "Gentile Clientele." Handsome matrons emerge on the terrace overlooking the ocean. A couple of blondes, wearing terry-cloth robes over a coal-black tan, go into a conference with their escorts. They're trying to decide whether to swim in the tiled swimming pool at their feet or in the green ocean just 50 yards away. They settle for another drink and a needed rest on the beach under a large striped umbrella. All around you are other couples, trios, handsome families, everybody dressed easily and exquisitely. Whatever else has been said about these people, and it has been practically everything, they are the handsomest, best dressed, and best behaved of the very rich anywhere. They also look extremely healthy, in a careless, natural way, although it is conceivable that before nightfall the life of a troubled oilman may finally expire for all its beautiful mask of tan and Waikiki shorts. In the late afternoon they will go into the shadow of their suites again to rest or dress for an evening in the Peacock Room, the Flamingo Bar, or any of a score of modern nightclubs, sprouting metal blinds and fine pastel greens and blues. Apparently there is little cliquishness in this town. There are no places where movie stars or businessmen or writers may expect to meet only their kind. Everybody here is presumably rich and wanting to play, and the only variety at the clubs is in the type of entertainment. You sit up at a bar and watch the archetypes of Miami manhood, the playboys in their late 30s or early 40s, wearing polo shirts, slacks, wristwatches. All are tanned, all slightly weary. They are either talking about somebody's love affair with a woman in her middle 30s, or foxily eyeing the showgirls who, after each performance, come up to the bar to seize their contract drinks. This is the status quo, and while you're there, the Army sets it rocking. It seems that, in the first conference between the hotel operators and the Army's procurement men, a price had been agreed on that was thought fair enough by several attending Miami bankers and real estate men. While the contracts were on their way to Washington for signature, 5 or 6 of the hotels reneged on the deal and tried to double their original figure. The Army suspended its plans, and the hotel men sat back and confidently expected that the Army would be unable or unwilling to hold out against the unique attractions they had to offer. At this point, the editorial writers of the Gulf Coast papers suddenly felt a juicy story falling into their laps. They began to write little homilies about patriotism and human acquisitiveness that, considering the way the Gulf Coast feels about Miami, were masterpieces of understatement. The Army one day boldly declared that it had pulled out of the Miami Beach area and was looking elsewhere for a location for its training center. The West Coast began to hint modestly at its own advantages, and suggested that Bel Air, St. Petersburg, Tampa, and Clearwater were only a few of the places that had hotels only too willing to house an Air Corps in the interests of national defense. Nothing could have been better calculated to give Miami Beach an acute case of raging patriotism. It became known that the officer candidate school, which then included only about 500 men and another 500 administrators, would in all likelihood be expanded to a revolving personnel base of about 5,000 men. Before the war is over, an Army officer predicted, the replacement center would have a permanent population of not less than 45,000 men. Instantly, about 175 members of the Miami Beach Hotel Association passed a resolution unanimously agreeing to do business on the Army's terms. The Army officials called another meeting, and this time faced a more pliable, though apprehensive, body. Out of this tense conference came an official statement from General Ralph H. Wooten, commanding officer of the Air Corps Technical Training Command in that area. He said, in effect, that all was forgiven, and that the Army and the hotel men had agreed to locate the school and the center there on the Army's terms. Immediately, the publicity hounds of Miami Beach grabbed a camera and an expression of goodwill and started mailing back to the homes of the boys already here glossy 8x10s of sons posing in rude health on Miami's Coral Strand. The hotel keeper, who had hoped for a continuation into eternity of Miami's civilian pleasures, now explained that Miami Beach had everything to gain from an arrangement whereby half the hotels would be filled with soldiers and the other half with parents visiting them. You take a look at one of the hotels that the Army has moved into. A couple of weary trainees are stretched out on the satin coverlets of twin maple beds. Another is sitting at a modern unit desk and bureau, tilting the metal Venetian blinds to adjust the strong light to taste of his reclining friends. Downstairs, the Flamingo Bar has been converted into a projection theater for slide lectures on ballistics. You hear afterwards that the crux of the negotiations were reached on a sunny afternoon when the Army acquainted the hotel operators with its normal basic rate. The hotel keepers started to expound the woes of their business. They pointed out that most of the big hotels had been built at a cost of anything up to $500,000. Through the winter season, they asked and got anything from $20 to $35 a room a day. The Army repeated its grievous news that its basic rate was $10 a man a month. It would be hard to imagine a more exquisite opportunity for use of the word compromise. But the deadlock was resolved by a young lieutenant who remarked that the Army does not theoretically engage rooms, it rents cubic feet. After a moment's silence, the perspiration rolled happily down the foreheads of the hotel men. The only problem now was how many men you could pack into a room 16 by 20. A little hasty arithmetic was figured on scratch pads, and the conference was amicably ended. The only headache they had to wrestle with was how to store or dispose of the furniture and furnishings. For, again, the Army likes its cubic feet to be uninhibited by 4-poster beds and Jacobean trestles. It is true to say that most of the hotel owners were frankly enthusiastic about the prospect of the beach's contribution to the war effort. The alternative, they now clearly saw, was between a 3-month season at $25 a day a room and an unending season at a rate of $60, $80, $100, or even more dollars a room a month. The happiest of the innkeepers was one whose hostelry had been built in 1938 at a cost of $800,000. He was carrying a $400,000 mortgage, and he figured that with the help of the Army he could start paying it off. The authentic Miami touch was added by one glowing real estate man who described the Air Corps invasion of Miami Beach as a simple switch from a normal winter season to a 12-month Army season. That ends Chapter 4, and thank you for listening.